My name is Jonathan Burtfield. I'm a partner at Spinnaker Consulting, and I'm faculty at Lean Startup Company. And we're going to talk today about what I think is a genuine crisis in the world of business that we're operating in. So I'm going to focus on innovation and leadership of innovation. So just give me a sense in the room, who of you are actually consider yourself as in a leadership position in innovation in your companies? So just a show of hands. All right, so enough. So we'll get a mix here in terms of some of you who are going to be listening to this and thinking, how do I react to it? And some of you will be thinking, how do my managers and those around me react to some of these messages? So crisis. What do we mean by crisis? Why is there a crisis? So I arrived, I live in New York, and I arrived on Sunday, and this was a crisis. For some reason, I decided to load up the car and put my keys where my bag was in the boot of the car at the back, and close the boot without having unlocked the rest of the car. And so I had to get one of the guys from Budget to crank open the car, and that's me kind of in the background trying to work out to press the little button. Crisis, right? Real drama. Could have been like 4 hours waiting for a spare key. That was a crisis. We're not talking about that kind of crisis, right? Temporary, we move on from it fairly quickly. We're talking about a leadership crisis. So those who are managing the world that we think about. So I grew up in England. I made Aliyah and lived in Israel for a few years, and then got lured away by the delights of Silicon Valley and New York. And so I've seen various leaders around the world who are either managing or creating crisis, depending on your perspective of whoever these individuals are on the screen. Leaders have a real impact on the kind of work that we do and the kind of value that we can offer to our businesses and our customers. But I'm going to narrow it down a little bit further to say innovation. What do we mean by an innovation leadership crisis? So one of the ways to think about this, does anyone know who this gentleman is on the screen? One more? Not Henry Ford, no, close, but not Henry Ford. It's actually Alfred Sloan. So he was the GM and longtime president of General Motors. And he came around to lead that business for a really long time. And he was a leader driving the, obviously expansion of a large automobile company. And he invented and supported and drove a lot of the leadership techniques that became dominant for most of the 20th century. So things like annual planning cycles and strategic planning and various accounting methodologies that allowed us to predict and manage what would happen from one build cycle to the next. And that was in a time when there was a really lot of consistency. Who were our customers? What did they want? How would we support them over the time of their value that we could give them as a company? A lot of consistency, not much change. The challenge, and this is where I think we have a crisis, is for a lot of organizations, we're still managing the business the same way that Alfred Sloan was managing it in the 1920s. We've updated a lot of the way we build products in terms of software and how we manufacture things, but the way that we manage at the enterprise level across the organization, we haven't really changed how we think about that. We're still using the same accounting methodologies, we're still using many of the same planning, the same strategy organization thinking. We haven't adapted to the world we live in today. There's a great lead-in from the conversation we had just a moment ago with Lior, talking about the speed of change and how we as individuals need to adapt and become more agile to the world around us. We also need to see how we can change how we're leading organizations, how we think about bringing value to our customers and innovating in a way that's different than we have for the last 100 years. We can't keep operating with the same approaches. I spend most of my time working in large companies across a really wide variety of domains. And one thing that's consistent across all of these types of companies, all of these businesses, sorry, I'll just go back to that slide, all of these areas, is they all have the same problem. So they're operating in vastly different parts of the world, in vastly different content areas, vastly different products that they're delivering, and yet they're all seeing the same problem. So I go into government organizations, and I'm talking to leaders there who are managing their products, and they're still taking 2-3 years to move from we have an idea to we're delivering some value to the customer. They're still thinking about innovation as inspiration. We have an idea, let's build it. We treat products that are emerging and innovative in exactly the same way as we do products that are already in the market and have been there for a long time. Doesn't matter whether that's insurance, in banking, in large companies, in smaller companies. The same challenge is there that our leaders are still thinking in exactly the same way about how to build products. And often the response of leaders when they hear we need to be doing things differently is let's send our teams to some workshops. Let's get our product managers to do some value proposition and business model canvas. Let's get our engineers working in a more agile way. Let's put Scrum teams in. Let's get SAFe deployed across our entire organization. And I spend about half of my time running these kind of workshops. And in the moment, they're fantastic. But really, they're just an incredible waste of a lot of really nice Post-it notes. Because what happens is we train teams up, we educate them in how to think differently, they come back into their office and into the workplace, and their managers and the leaders are thinking exactly the same way. So all of a sudden, we've got teams that are really excited to move quickly, to be agile, to be nimble, to be thinking in a responsive way about who their customer is and how to deliver value. And their managers are saying, well, I need a business plan for the next 10 years. And they run into that buzzsaw on a daily basis because their leaders are not willing to change. This is a quote from a colleague of mine, a guy called Barry O'Reilly. And he sees this, and I see this on a regular basis. Leaders stand up in front of their organization, the CEOs, the chief product officers, the chief technology officers, chief innovation officers, and they say, it's really important that we change, that we do things differently. And what they really mean is the folks over here who are building the products, the folks over there who are the engineers and the product teams, they're the ones who are going to change. We in the leadership team, we in the C-suite, we're going to keep doing things exactly the same way as we've always done them. I got to this position as the CEO, as the CTO, by being right and by knowing how to do things. So I don't need to listen to the customers. I don't need to think about iterative cycles of learning. I just need to know the answers, and we'll all be good. I'll tell you how to do this. That's a huge challenge, and that's a crisis because inevitably we get stuck in building the same products that we always built, building them in the same way and taking too long to deliver value. So what we see from leaders is a complete lack of strategy. They don't even know how to define strategy in many ways. They say, we're going to be huge. We're going to be the dominant player here. They don't communicate why. They don't communicate how we're going to know. They don't communicate how we're going to measure that progress and that success. They're driven by short-term financial results, mostly because large organizations who are public are driven by quarterly results. They create a toxic culture where the idea of changing the way that we work runs counter to the hierarchy in our organization. Coming up with new ideas is often a challenge to the domain that somebody is working in. If a new idea comes along, it's going to take resources away from the businesses that I'm currently running. So how do we manage that tension? I'm just going to squash the new idea. I'm going to raise the bar so high that no one in the organization can really challenge my ownership of this business. That brings fear, that brings people to say, I'm not really going to come up with new ideas. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave. I'm going to go and start my own great new startup, and we live in an environment where there's lots of opportunity for that and lots of funding, so great. What does that do to the large organization that is trying to build value and build itself as an innovative organization? We heard from Lior about learnings, about the importance of us as individuals learning from experimentation, from cycles that we succeed or fail in. How do we absorb that as individuals? Across an enterprise, even more important, when projects fail, what do we do about that? How do we make sure that the value that was generated doesn't walk out the door when we fire those people? It actually comes back in and we can say, let's do better next time. So when we think about innovation, it's a process. It doesn't just happen by sitting in a room and coming up with great ideas. If we want to build a large organization that's capable of innovating over time, we need to make sure that we understand how to do that, how it can be repeated, how we can train people to do it, how we can measure the progress, and how we can make sure that what we're generating are actually genuinely new solutions that deliver value to our users and to the business. So I want to go through using a frame of reference from Scott Cook, who was the CEO and founder of Intuit. I see they're represented here. I'm not sure if anyone in the room is from Intuit, but he had this great quote about the shifting role of leaders, how we really need to think differently, move away from being the wise person in the room who has all the answers, to a leader who is building value by driving their teams, by asking the right questions. How can we push our teams to be thinking in a way that says, we don't know all the answers. Things are moving so fast. Customers' expectations are changing all the time. Technology is moving so fast. We can't rely on what happened 5 years ago, so therefore my wisdom about the marketplace is less and less relevant every day. So we need to push our teams to understand what are the right questions. So I want to look at this frame of innovation and innovation leadership through what are the questions that we as leaders should be asking ourselves. So strategy, let's start there. Do we actually have a strategy that's relevant to innovation? Do we understand what those words mean, strategy and innovation? How we're going to measure it? Do we understand how that relates to all of the other activities that we're doing? So our core business versus innovation. What about the companies that we might want to acquire? How do they relate to our innovation activity? And how are we going to measure it? One of the key components of an effective strategy is that we know whether we get there or not. So what are those measures going to be? Right? Key question for leaders, asking these questions. So we look, for example, at a potential innovation strategy framework. Some of you may be familiar with this from McKinsey, which talks about who our customers are and what the products are that we're building. It's a way of framing, this is what we care about as we're innovating. Are we going to focus on our core business? Are we going to focus on businesses that are adjacent to us, either because we're new products or new customers? Or are we going to go after completely new businesses with completely new customers? Doesn't really matter where you land on this strategy, but that you have one and that you can articulate it. And that the teams who are building and thinking about what new products they should be focused on, they can look back at it. And so we can look at, for example, how we're going to allocate our funding across these different strategic areas. How much of our spend are we going to put into our core business, which is our current operating model today, versus businesses that are treating new customers and new products? How do we allocate our spending, and what are we likely to see? So this is some numbers that the team who came up with this framework think about as kind of the golden ratio, which is kind of the ideal starting point. So what's really critical here is that 10% of transformational, right, which is out in the distance, new products, new customers, we've never operated there before, we're going to spend 10% of our investment now, and in the future that's going to return 70% of our revenue. Right? Most of those things will die, right? So 90% of that 10% will actually disappear, and we'll get some unicorns coming out of that in our business, which will deliver 70% of our future value. That's a strategy. As a team, we can understand we can take some risks because we know that some of our ideas are going to fail, but we have to go after certain opportunities that are going to be huge. So how do we do that? Experiment, iterate, agile, whatever methodology you want to use, we've got a strategy that we're working towards. When we think about our portfolio, right, so the mix of products that we have that are aligned to our strategy, so we can ask as leaders, well, what does that mix look like? Do we have the right products in there? Are we targeting the right areas that can serve as things that will deliver value to us? If we don't have the right mix, what are the gaps? How do we fill those gaps? Do we acquire? Do we build? Do we partner? All of these things are key for us to understand, well, what should we do as a team that aligns with what our leadership is driving us towards? So when we look at a company like John Deere, okay, so John Deere is a traditional industrial company that builds tractors. Many of you may have driven on one of those. I don't know, I did once when I was on kibbutz here. It was a lot of fun, nearly died, but let's leave that aside. They are evolving what their business is made up of. They're no longer focused on, we build tractors. Their business is shifting to a strategy that's focused on farming as a service. So they're delivering acres of growth. They're delivering, making sure that the farmer has what they need in order to get their crop yield. Right? So this is a strategy that isn't saying we're going after new businesses and new customers. Right? It's saying we're focusing on our core understanding of our market, and we're going to add incrementally based on that strategy. So we're going to have lots of technology, lots of innovation around what this thing is that digs holes and sows the crops. Right? It's a really focused strategy that is intended to grow the business. We can articulate it. Teams can understand what they need to do. They can understand what they should and should not be doing. Life cycle. So what do we mean by this? So products don't just emerge out of thin air. Products emerge from a process of iterating early, deciding which ideas have traction, discarding the ones that don't, and investing and doubling down in the ideas that are really going to be powerful and drive growth. So what is the life cycle that we are operating as a company? How do we distinguish between the things where we're searching for a new business model, so we're experimenting, we're not quite sure whether there's real value there, versus the thing which is our core business, we've been doing it for a long time, we need to optimize those things. Do we look at them in the same way? Do we invest in them in the same way? Do we manage our teams and assign our teams in the same way? Can the same people who are really great at executing against a long-term P&L, can they actually operate searching for and iterating and experimenting in a startup mindset? Or do we need different people in those roles as they build products and they move through the life cycle? How do we evaluate those products as they move through there? What criteria do we use to say that has traction versus this other product idea that does not? How do we manage that as a leader when our general instinct is to say, well, the things that are going to be successful are the things that I'm familiar with, the things that I built in the past, the things that I understand the technology. So if you're a leader in an organization, you've never dealt with AI or machine learning, and you're faced with a new product idea where the team is really excited and they're using a technology that you as a leader have never been involved with, how do you evaluate that idea? Do you say, well, it wasn't relevant when I was making these products, so therefore it doesn't have a place in my business? So we see lots of organizations where we have leadership establishing a life cycle that measures the progress through early idea to mature and then exit. So this comes from MasterCard as some work that I've been doing there, where we're understanding what does early mean? What is the difference between a prototype and a market test, a pilot? How do we evaluate those things in different ways and make sure that we can understand in a consistent way, are they aligned to strategy? Should we continue to invest in them? Do we have the right teams assigned to these areas? When we talk about this idea of searching for new business models versus executing, we can understand how we map those against our portfolio. So if we look, for example, at how Amazon's portfolio might be set up, and this is fairly rudimentary, this isn't exactly precise here, but giving an illustration of how their products are mapped differently and how they're invested in differently because they're in search versus execute. So they're going to invest vastly different amounts of money, teams, risk for things which are really early, right? So their air drone delivery service, right? Getting a lot of investment, a lot of press coverage, but the risks that they're taking there in the investment are minuscule compared to what they're spending on their e-commerce business. And appropriately so, because one is still, we're still trying to work out, is this real? Do we care about this? The teams who are working on it are very different than the teams who are just focused on maximizing their margin in their core business. So we've got a strategy, which is growth. We've got a life cycle, which is managing these things differently because of the places where they are in that journey. And that all comes together with an understanding of how we make decisions. So we're making decisions as an organization based on a strategy. So how do we release funding to those ideas that are emerging, to those products that have a life and are things that we should be focused on versus the things that are not? So metered funding is one of the ways that we talk about that, where we're kind of dripping out funds based on progress, not just on, I have a really great idea, give me $10 million to execute against this. Instead, I'm going to use the life cycle to say, well, get to this point where you can show me that there is actually a problem. Show me that you've got some customers who care. Show me that you've run a pilot where you've got 10 customers to sign a letter of intent to say they're willing and excited about taking up this product. Right? We can say we can make those decisions based on our strategy, based on where they're on the life cycle, and based on how we've structured our governance. So this is an example of a life cycle. This is something we built at Pearson, an education company, where we're focused on, we've got these various stages in our life cycle, and we've got a set of questions that are aligned to our strategy and to our focus on our portfolio mix that allow us to identify, as leaders, whether we should move forward with this product or not, whether we should be getting out of this business because the opportunity is no longer where we thought it was 10, 15 years ago. Now we need to move our resources, both people and dollars, into new opportunities. So we've got a systematic way for leaders to respond to the opportunities in front of them. And we can set up a hierarchy of decision-making groups that all understand the strategy that's set by senior leadership, passed down to the various businesses and portfolios, and then the teams, whether they're product teams, agile teams at scale, whatever they're doing, they understand why they're doing it, what the criteria are for success. Product. So we're building products. How are we doing that? So when leaders are asking their teams to execute against this strategy, are we actually setting our teams up for success? Are they working with customers? Do they understand who their early adopters are versus the mainstream? Are we able to understand the data that's coming back is aligned to the strategy because the teams understand it and they're equipped to do so? So when we look, this is an operating model from a company called Wayfair, which is in the retail space. So they've taken, for example, the Spotify model, which many of you may be familiar with, and they've adapted it to their organizations. They've got various work streams. They've got small teams based on a cross-functional mix of product, engineering, marketing, design that are aligned to those particular areas of focus. So again, what we're seeing here is we're seeing this trickle down of we've got a strategy, we've got an allocation of resources, and we're managing our teams based on that vision. And then lastly, I want to talk about culture. So we've got all of these things in place. We've got our strategies. We're telling our teams that they need to take certain risks. The reality is, and we all know this from any of the work that we do, not everything always goes smoothly. Often there are failures. As a leader in an organization, what do I do when that happens? When things don't go well? When I've told my teams to take risk, they took a risk, and guess what? It didn't work out. Do I fire that team? Am I capable of celebrating that failure, celebrating the learning that emerged from it, and declaring that we need to do more of that? When failure isn't an option, we can forget about creativity, learning, and innovation. This is from an interesting thought leader, Brené Brown, who isn't really in the commercial space, but is really interesting if any of you want to read her books. But what it's saying to us is very clearly, if we have a strategy that's demanding innovation, we need to give our teams room to actually operate as innovators. And that means not everything will work out. We need to encourage that and talk about that. So when we look at a company like SpaceX, one of their first areas of focus has been, in order for this business to be viable, we need to be able to reuse the rockets that launch the satellites into space or do whatever we're going to do with it. There's a great video of kind of the 50+ failures of their rockets to actually land effectively on the moving platforms, set to some nice opera music. It's kind of fun to watch. And what's happening there is the organization, the company, the leadership is saying, every time one of those rockets crashes, we learn a little bit more about how to make sure that our next rocket will be successful. The team who allowed that rocket to crash did not fail. They learned something that is driving the innovative capacity of the organization. That comes from leadership. That comes from the capacity of leaders to say, it's okay for me as a leader to be managing a team that wasn't successful in that particular moment, because we're driving towards a long-term strategy that demands that we take risks. That takes bravery, that takes courage, that takes a shift away from the leader is always right, the leader understands exactly all the answers to any possible situations. They don't, they shouldn't, they can't, and it's okay for leaders to talk that way because it projects the focus that they have, which is driving a business towards whatever their strategy says, growth, etc. So these are the pillars that we've just talked about, right? So we've got strategy, portfolio, life cycle, governance, product, and culture. These are the things that underpin innovation inside a large organization if we want to make it sustainable, if we want to make it something that happens on a continuous basis, that is driving our organizations forward, that isn't reliant on us hiring the next Steve Jobs in order for us to have the next great product. We need to make sure that our teams are capable, they're set up, they understand what they're doing, why they're doing it. So the challenge for any of you who are leaders, or for those of you who work with leaders in innovation, when you see the sands washing away the foundation of what your current business is really focused on, when you see that what we were good at before is no longer as valuable as it used to be, we need a new opportunity, we need new ways of thinking, we need new products in our mix and in our portfolio, we need a new strategy, we need to be asking new questions. What are you doing to manage your innovation crisis? So I'll leave it there. We are running an all-day workshop tomorrow. You can either come find me or Yael or one of the other folks from Agile Sparks, or you can go to that URL. We're going to be digging into a lot of these questions and really thinking about how can we come up with the right questions and sometimes the right answers to drive our innovation forward. Thank you very much.